Great. Julie, why don't you take it away?
Great. Thank you very much. So thank you for joining us today. My name is Julie Fisher-Rowe, and I'm the Acting Director of Narrative, Training, and Journalism at the Opportunity Agenda. And today I'm here with my colleague, Lucy Odige-Turly.
Yeah.
And we're going to be sharing with you
I think I'll be able to, as long as I can also have the data set.
Sorry, if people could mute their line, that would be great, just so that we can get a nice, clean recording. Anyway, so today we're going to be sharing some research that we've conducted on how to talk about racial equity and racial justice in what's happening today's in the headlines and just in the discourse today. The Opportunity Agenda is a social justice communications lab. We focus on social justice issues and human rights issues, all with a racial equity lens. We have 3 initiative areas in which we give particular focus, and that is immigration, criminal justice, and anti-poverty initiatives. We do all of that, again, with a racial justice and human rights lens. So today what we're going to be sharing with you is an overview of key findings from this research that we did with our partners at Unidos US and with Lake Research Partners. And it is concerning, we're calling it Future Over Fear, but it really is how do we tell a story about the kind of country that we want to be, the kind of country that we envision, about inclusion and diversity, over exclusion and fear of others, and how to handle some of the anxiety that we're seeing in many of our audiences, both audiences who might be a little bit worried about diversity or concerned, and audiences who feel a real fear from some of the really harmful rhetoric that we're seeing about different communities, including communities of color, immigrants, and Muslim Americans. So we're going to share this research. Lucy's going to share with you the methodology, the goals, and finally the messages that we were able to test. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some strategies for taking this out into the world and how this research can help you shape the messages that you're developing around the issues that you're working on. And all of this is a precursor to, this is part 1 of 2. In the next webinar on January 29th, we will be actually taking a look at some of the messages that you've developed, and we'll give you some ideas about how to do that. And we will then also kind of workshop those. So we're really looking forward to working with all of you. And I'm going to turn it over to Lucy, who is our Senior Coordinator for Research at the Opportunity Agenda.
Thank you so much, Joanne. As you said, my name is
Lucy, I think I'm having trouble hearing now. I think you might be coming up on your computer end.
Sorry about this, guys.
So Lucy, I think we can hear you on both the phone and the computer. So I'm not sure exactly how to do that.
Hi, Lucy, did you figure out the problem?
How is that? Do I sound better?
We're getting an echo.
Okay. I'm going to see if I can stop sharing the screen. Let me see.
So, are folks still there?
Is everybody there?
Okay.
Yes, we're here.
Okay.
All right.
Okay, hold on.
I'm going to go on mute, though. Yeah.
Okay. Hi. Okay. So am I sounding better?
Yeah, there's still some weird things going on. But,
I hear.
Okay, so I'm going to go
I hear too. They're just starting up.
Everybody could just please mute their line. That would be
Lucy's
great.
asking if you can mute their phone line.
Hey,
Wait, Lucy, can you just hold on for a second? Hey, folks, can everybody please mute your line?
Oh.
Okay, Lucy, please take it away. I'm sorry about all these issues.
Thank you, everyone, for your patience. Okay, so as my colleague Julie Fisher-Rowe was saying, we today share with you some of the top-line findings from our research that we conducted in collaboration with Lake Research Partners and Unidos US, formerly the National Council of La Raza, back in February and March of 2017. So before I dive into some of the top-line findings, I want to give you a little bit of context of what we're trying to achieve going into the research project. So one of the overarching goals, directly following the election, we're in the midst of probably one of the, most upticks in overt kind of fear-mongering and xenophobic and openly racist dialogue in social discourse. So what we wanted to do was identify message frames that most effectively help persuadable but unpersuaded Americans distinguish some of the legitimate policy concerns that they were having from some of the kind of unacceptable racial stereotypes that we were seeing propagated in political discourse. We also wanted to identify narratives that enabled Americans who may have concerns about demographic change to envision a future that was, ideally attractive but at least acceptable. So attached to those two overarching goals, moving into the research, we wanted to develop, test, and refine messages that position folks such as yourself to advance some of these policy goals that we had. So how did we go about doing that? In February of 2017, we conducted 6 focus groups in 3 strategic areas, so Charlotte, North Carolina, Phoenix, Arizona, and Baltimore, MD, with groups of white men, white women, African-American men and women, and Latino men and women. And we asked them questions varying from, like, how are you feeling, what are you anxious about, to their, more specific policy-oriented questions about the Muslim travel ban and how they felt about different immigration policies. Following the focus groups, we administered a national online dial survey to over 1,000 registered voters. It was a national representative sample, but we also included over samples of 100 African Americans, Latinos, millennials, and advocates such as yourself, because we don't want to develop messaging that folks that we are working with wouldn't actually go out and actually use and say. So in that national dial survey, people were exposed to the messaging that we developed, and you're going to hear 3 of those messages today. So what did we find out? We found out that as of March 2017, about 33% of registered voters fall under what we would consider our base. So our base currently strongly embraces the idea of diversity, not only as a principle and a value, but as a national strength. They see it as something that uniquely defines America. They believe that diversity helps us solve problems, both politically and socially. Discrimination towards many groups is a very serious problem, and they also see a strong role for government for not only alleviating some of these issues, but also ensuring that everyone has equal opportunity. So our base is more likely to be women, younger, Democratic, and African Americans, but this is not synonymous. There are people who identified as Republicans who now fall into our base. And I'd like to make a point about that 33%. Finding that is actually really important. Usually when we do this type of research, we find that your base is around the 20% mark. And so the fact that it's 33% and so high means directly following the election, there was some movement. And so folks that typically would have maybe fallen into a persuadable audiences had been moved and had been activated to move into our base. So that's a really, really important finding and really great opening for advocates such as yourself. Opposition. So on the opposite end of the spectrum, we found about 17% of registered voters that we surveyed fell into our opposition. The opposition are currently ambivalent or against the notion of diversity. They believe that government assistance has created a culture of dependency, and they also believe, quote, minorities use racism as an excuse for their own failures. So they're more likely to be male, older, white, from the South, and Republican, but again, this is not a partisan breakdown. This is based on their responses to a series of questions that we administered in that national dial survey. There are Democrats and people in the Northeast who fall into our opposition branch. And a lot of folks are surprised whenever we give them the 17% result, because it is a very vocal and organized and coordinated opposition. So the other 50% are persuadables when it comes to attitudes about racial equity, immigration, and a myriad of other social and so-called issues. And they have attitudes, unsurprisingly, that overlap with both our base and opposition. They closely reflect the current demographics of registered voters. However, they're slightly more likely to be Latino. And it's really important to note that persuadables, whilst having valuables that overlap, they're extremely malleable, particularly when their fears about demographic change are played into. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about that today. So what I want to do is walk you through some of the attitudes and beliefs that currently define our base, our opposition, and persuadable audiences. As I said, this isn't a partisan breakdown. This isn't necessarily about political affiliation. This is more so about people's responses to a series of questions that gauge their attitudes towards race, towards inequality, towards economic opportunities. So directly following the election, one of the key things that we wanted to do with this research was understand how people, what their current concerns were, what their anxieties were. And so I'm going to draw your attention to the top line. We asked, one of the series of questions that we asked was, thinking about things in America today, how concerned are you about each of the following on a scale of 0 to 10, with 8 to 10 being kind of highly concerned? And so we found across the board, regardless of your political orientation, your ideology, the tone of politics and political conversation is an issue that is currently of high concern for all Americans. So we find 79% of our base, 64% of the opposition, and also 64% of persuadable audiences. We also found pretty much across the board, less so among the opposition, that the ability for people to make ends meet for their families was also a really high concern among many registered voters. But then after that, we see a divergence of opinion. So you see here that among our base and persuadable audiences, the level of respect for people from different cultures is a very high concern. So 75% of the base and 62% of persuadable audiences, but only 27% of the opposition. But what is concerning the opposition? If you go down to that line with that lone circle, you see that the ability to trust the media is a major concern of the opposition, but also a considerable amount, 62% of persuadable audiences. So that's something to keep in mind when you're thinking about your own outreach. So another series of questions that we asked were intended to gauge people's attitudes towards racial and economic equity. And we'll see here, again, I draw your attention to the top line, that this notion of political division and the tone of politics is, again, something that is concerning all registered voters, regardless of their political orientation. 82% of the base, 74% of opposition, and 68% of persuadable audiences are very concerned currently about political division. But again, divergence of opinion begins when it comes to racial relations between racial and ethnic groups, racial division, racial discrimination, and economic inequality. We see that these are very high concerns among our base, very high concerns among persuadable audiences, so always in the 60% range, but just not a concern, particularly racial discrimination, among the opposition. So we wanted to find out a little bit more granular and ask people's level of concern or how serious they believe discrimination against specific groups in America is today. And so we see across the board that our base audience is very concerned or feel that discrimination is a very serious problem against Muslims, immigrants, Black, African Americans, Hispanic or Latinos, as well as women, so among Asian and Pacific Islanders, and not at all among whites. But we see here that both the base and persuadable audiences are significantly more likely, opposition and persuadable audiences are significantly more likely than the base to view discrimination against white Americans as a very serious problem currently facing the nation. So a key thing that we wanted to achieve in this research project was find out a little bit more about how racial attitudes were shaping levels of support for different issues, whether it was immigration policy, specific policies such as the travel ban and the proposal to build a border wall, and just general attitudes towards policies that are intended to alleviate economic inequality. So we see here across the board that the opposition overwhelmingly agrees with statements designed to identify racial antagonism. And so by racial antagonism, I mean it's an index that was created by researchers as a more effective way of measuring racial attitudes. And this index is a great way of predicting levels of support, as I said, for particular social policies. So we see here that generally the opposition agrees with these types of statements. So for instance, please indicate your level of support or whether you strongly agree or strongly disagree with the following statements. Reverse discrimination, where whites are put at a disadvantage in order to benefit minorities, is a growing problem. 89% of the opposition agrees with this statement, but also 68% of persuadable audiences. So again, that malleability that I talked about at the beginning of the presentation is very clear when it comes to this index. Another statement, too often minorities use racism as an excuse for their own failures. This is something that is strongly agreed with by 97% of the opposition, but also 73% of persuadable audiences. Again, it's unfair for us to have to sacrifice and pay the price through government-funded programs today for discrimination that happened decades ago. 30% of the base agree with the statement, 94% of opposition, and 68% of persuadable audiences. So again, we hear there's been a lot of discussion about whether or not to talk directly about race, and we see here that race is playing a significant role in shaping people's not only perceptions of what's going on in America, the current local climate, but also their levels of support for government programs. So I want to just quickly go over our values and language, because we didn't want to just find out what people's attitudes were towards particular social issues. We wanted to know what values are really resonating with people directly following the election. So we asked a series of questions to try and gauge what values are really resonating. And we found across the board that freedom, respect, and dignity were values that were really kind of resonating with people. There was something that they saw as foundational not only to their identity as Americans, but things that they felt were important to maintain and protect in order for us to have a functioning and safe society. The idea that hatred or bigotry is something that is not innate or ingrained, but is something that is taught, but more importantly, is something that can be undone, was something that resonated significantly with our base, but also with persuadable audiences. And we see here 56% of opposition also agreed with that statement and that value. The idea that everyone has to try to interrupt bigotry and prejudice, so these aren't just concepts that are out there, these are things that we have to actively try and counter, was something that really resonated. So we see 91% of the base and 66% of persuadable audiences were in very high agreement with this statement. And finally, the idea about embracing diversity, not only because it helps unite us, but because it makes us stronger as a country, were values and principles that resonate very much with our base and with persuadable audiences. Okay, so I'm going to move you on to the messages now, where I'm going to actually play you some of the messages that we tested with the 1,000 registered voters that we surveyed back in March. So for those of you who have not seen the dial test videos, what you're going to see is 4 lines. One line is going to be the cover line is going to be our opposition. The green line is going to be persuadable. The blue line will be our base, and there will be another yellow line, and that yellow line represents advocates. So we did an oversample of people who self-identify as social justice advocates within our and Advocacy US network, because we really wanted to understand how folks such as yourself are reacting to these messages. And so as they dial up, it means they like what they hear. As they dial down, it means they're not liking what they hear, and everyone begins at the 50% mark. And so the first message I'm going to play you is the opposition message. So it is the message of fear. It's the something that you should all recognize at this point. It's the fear-mongering. It's the scapegoating that has become, unfortunately, more of a kind of central part of our political discourse. So let me share my screen.
This conference is being recorded.
Okay, so the first message is the opposition message.
Keeping the people of this country safe is a core responsibility of our government. We cannot let political correctness and fear of offending someone stand in the way of protecting our country. It's common sense to take a closer look at people from countries and religious sects that have attacked and threatened us in the very recent past. It's common sense to protect ourselves from drugs and violence in Mexico through aggressive law enforcement and protecting our borders. And it's common sense for police to stop people more often in high-crime neighborhoods, even though those neighborhoods are often majority black. These actions are not racist. They are common sense steps for keeping our country and people safe.
You see here in this message, the opposition couldn't dial down faster. The advocates couldn't dial down faster enough the yellow line. As soon as they hear we cannot let political correctness or fear of offending, they immediately start dialing down. But what you see is that, unfortunately, this message really resonates with persuadable audiences. So that common sense trope is really effective in terms of making sure that persuadable audiences who don't necessarily want to be seen as racist feel comfortable with some of these policies. So it's the core responsibility of our government to keep you safe. You immediately see an uptick among persuadable audiences. And the idea that over-policing and travel bans, these things are common sense ways of keeping you safe. So the idea of safety is really effective in playing towards the malleability of persuadable audiences. But the good news is we developed or found 3 messages that beat this opposition message. So the first one I'm going to play you is called diversity as a strength. So we saw in the polling data that the idea that diversity is a national strength that makes the nation stronger, it helps us solve problems, is something that really resonates among base and persuadable audiences. So we developed this message specifically to kind of target that value. Here we go.
We are stronger when we work together and when we learn from each other's experiences united as Americans. When people from different backgrounds join together, we all benefit from the diversity of those perspectives. It helps us find new ways to deal with old challenges. But we are not taking full advantage of this source of strength. If we embraced our diversity and valued the views of our fellow Americans, we'd be more likely to find solutions to our problems and better ensure that everyone has the opportunity to pursue their dreams. Whether white, black, or Latino, whether Christian, Jew, or Muslim, we are all Americans. We need to embrace our different experiences, perspectives, and cultures because united we stand and divided we fall.
So we see with this message, the flip, the purple line is now at the bottom and the yellow line is now at the top. What really resonates or works well with this message is the idea that when people from different backgrounds join together, we are more in a better position to solve problems. You see with the base, they begin to dial up when they hear the idea that if we embrace our diversity and value the views of others, it actually makes us stronger, not weaker. And this message it resonates more with persuadable audiences than the opposition message. That message is clear and common sense to subjugate people. This message actually kind of activates them more and holds them more towards the end. So the next message I'm going to play you is called Real America. And this one really was a birth child of our partners at US. They were very concerned as what they saw as a very kind of coordinated attack and attempt to delegitimize what it meant to be an American and Latino and Muslim and other communities' status as real Americans. And so this message is really kind of challenging that frame, but also building on the fact that many Americans, as we saw in the polling data, were concerned about the tone and divisiveness of political discourse. So Real America is intended as a counter to some of that tone and really kind of like the divided feeling that many people felt directly following the election. So this message is called Real America.
America is a nation of values founded on an idea that all men and women are created equal. And while we all have our circles, whether they are our family, co-workers, or friends on Facebook, how we treat others outside of our circles reflects our commitment to the values that define us as Americans. It's not about what you look like or where you were born that makes you American. It's how you live your life and what you do that defines you here in this country. We are better as people and as a country when we welcome our neighbors, care for each other, and help those in need. We are better when we embrace our differences.
So an important thing to note about this message and also the previous one, diversity as a strength, is that typically in this type of research, what you want to see is the opposition line, the purple line, fall below the 50% line. So that's called isolating the opposition. So these two messages are more unifying, and it's because they have values that resonate with both people regardless of their political orientation. And so you see here that all the lines are staying above 50%. That being said, this is still what I would call an entryway message. This is a great message to begin a conversation because it has values that most people can embrace and therefore they're listening. So things that work, America is a nation of values, It's founded on the idea that all of us are created equal. It hasn't always lived up to that value, but it's something that is a defining value of the nation. And how we treat others outside of our circles is something that defines us. So that really touches on the fact that people are really concerned of how divided the country is, and that we need to come together and at least have conversations and begin a dialogue with people outside of our digital and in-person circles. You see here that the base begins to the opposition begins to dial down when they hear it's not about what you look like or where you're from. So the purple line is an immediate downshoot, but this message holds the persuadable audiences all the way through, as well as our base and our advocates. So the final message I'm going to play you is called pragmatism. And so this is a message that is a little bit more direct, and it names a culprit. So it talks about you're concerned about the tone of politics, you're concerned about how divided you feel the nation is. Well, who's to blame for that position? Who's to blame for the fear and the fear-mongering? So not only does it name a culprit, but it has a specific call to action. And so this message, you're going to actually see that the opposition is isolated. It falls below that 50% line. Okay, so it's called pragmatism.
Our country is changing, getting more and more diverse. It might make some of us uncomfortable, but it is our reality and a constant throughout our history. Politicians push unwise, divisive ideas like sending federal troops to police our cities, building a border wall, or singling out Muslim Americans because of their religion. If we take the bait on these, it makes our country weaker, not stronger. Our nation is stronger when every one of us can contribute and share ideas, and when everyone's basic rights and dignity are respected. We need to embrace ideas that unify us as a diverse people and make our country stronger. And we need to speak out against discrimination and prejudice when we see it.
So we see here, this is an isolating message. The purple line falls below the 50%, so the majority of the message. We see a beginning, an uptick by our base, our advocates, and persuadable audiences, and we talk about the fear. So if the country is getting more diverse, it's going to make people uncomfortable, but if we give in to fear, we make ourselves weaker, and that the idea of sending in federal troops and other kind of really regressive policies are actually working against us and don't uplift our values. So we actually see persuadable audiences kind of plateau at that point, because, as I said, they're very malleable and a little nervous. But again, this message holds them towards the end because they agree with the fundamental values that targeting particular communities in the name of keeping us safe actually go against our values as a nation. Well, I'm going to stop there. So I know I threw a lot of information at you. The slides are going to be shared with everybody who's participating today. But if you would like to find out more, you can actually read the messages on our website. It's available at opportunityagenda.org. And for those of you who'd like to take a deeper dive into some of the research findings, feel free to email me at lodg@opportunityagenda.org. And thank you, and I look forward to your questions at the end, and I'll hand it over to my colleague, Julie Fisher-Rowe.
Great. Thank you, Lucy. We're going to take questions at the end. I'm just going to go very quickly through 5 strategies for moving forward with this information. What can we do with it? How can we change the way we're talking about things? And how can we use it to open up conversations about diversity, about racial equity, and about the fear that many communities are facing? Next slide, please. Number 1 is to consider your audience, to always thinking about who you're talking to, why you're talking to them from a communication standpoint, and what you want them to do. And the research gives us some really helpful information about who those audiences are, gives us some helpful information about who is already open to conversations about diversity, who's a little less sure, and who we're probably just not going to move on the topic. And one way to think about this is on a scale from 1 to 5, thinking of 1s as your base, as your advocates, as the people who are ready to go, pick up a sign, make a phone call, do whatever it is that you want them to do to further your cause. And then there are the 2s through 4s. These are the persuadable folks who have more questions, who have more anxiety or uncertainty, who don't really know how to talk about race necessarily, who are not sure that they understand what the problems are around racial inequalities in this country, or not even sure that they believe that there inequality to the extent that we are saying. And so these folks need some ways. We need to figure out ways to open the conversation to them, to play on their values, tell them why they should care about these issues, tell them why it's part of their identity to care as an American, as a person in their community, as a Minnesotan or an Iowan or a New Yorker or whatever it might be, to really tell them why they care about these things and to bring them into a conversation. And then fives are the folks who are probably not going to be brought over. We can often spend a lot of time thinking about fives and how to change their minds or how to engage with them, but usually or often that ends in some kind of argument. And from a media standpoint in particular, a communication standpoint, that is not something that appeals to persuadable audiences, is to watch two sides argue about something. So in general, the strategy should be to be thinking about the fives in the way that Lucy described, which is how to isolate them from the rest of the persuadable folks, to make sure that their messages are not having a positive effect on the folks that we also want to persuade. So really to be thinking strategically, not about engaging with the fives, but trying to neutralize them. Next slide, please. Okay. And I know that the animations are not going to work, so I'm just going to describe what this slide is talking about. So to think about audience, sorry, there's some background noise. If everyone could mute, that would be great.
You may still have the garage code and all that.
But to think about where your audience sits in a 1 through 5, to think about what they're thinking about your issue, what they're hearing about their issue, what are the conversations that they're hearing about in media and culture conversations. So really scanning the media and making sure that you're aware of how your audiences are thinking about your issues. And then if you can get your hands on any kind of public opinion research, knowing what they're thinking can be really helpful in knowing where to start a conversation. And then knowing how they feel about your issue. This is really where values come into play, knowing what lens they're using to think about diversity and race. Are they thinking about an equality lens? Are they thinking about how important it is that we all treat each other equally and with dignity and respect? Or are they seeing diversity as something that's threatening? And do we need to think of a different way to approach the conversation to them? And then finally, what can they do? That's why we're talking to folks, is to really motivate them to be strategic. Again, I'm hoping that people can mute their lines.
Somebody's on the phone and we cannot hear the presenter. Can you please mute your phones if you're not a presenter, please? We can hear you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Sorry about that. It's always webinars can be challenging with technology as usual, but I'm hoping that you're seeing the information, and again, you all will get the slides. So again, the idea about audience is really just to be thinking strategically. You're out there communicating with limited time and limited resources and limited access to people. So really thinking about who am I talking to, why am I talking to them, what do I want them to do, and what's the best way for me to start the conversation with them is really going to be the most strategic way to use your limited time and resources. Next slide, please. We talk a lot about values at my organization. We talk about values-based communications, and there's a lot of reasons for this. Many of them are research-based, many of them are experience-based, but it really comes down to you want to start a conversation with shared values. You want to enter a conversation starting with a place of why you both care about the same thing. And finding that with your audiences is just an important part of communications because people don't change their mind based on facts alone. Facts are important. Despite what some people are saying today, facts are important. They're not sufficient to changing people's minds. You really need to start at a values-based. That's where people make decisions. So if we can start off finding a place where, again, the audiences agree with you, you can start a smoother conversation. So we did find in the research that talking about respect, treating people with respect and dignity, both resonated very strongly with most of the audiences that we're talking about. People really just feel like we're losing something in some of the discourse that's happening right now. And it's really important to bring that back, just to make sure that we all are being respectful and believing that everyone deserves dignity. And then moving to diversity is a really important value for most of our audiences. You saw it turn off the opposition, but again, that's only 17% of the population. So it is a value that we can talk about why diversity makes us stronger, why we're a better country because of our diverse backgrounds and experiences and skill sets and cultures. And all of those things mean that we bring more ideas to the table, means we can solve our problems in a more efficient and better way. And then some other values to think about are community, the idea of getting to know each other, coming together to be a strong collective community. It's not just about each of our individual wishes and dreams and hopes. It's not just about selfishness. It's about our shared responsibility for each other. That does resonate with a good amount of audiences. And this is one that's important because sometimes they can be drawn to the side of thinking in a very individualistic ways and thinking in ways that tend to promote selfishness and this kind of everybody out for themselves kind of idea. But they also have, most audiences also have this collective community value in their heads. And it's really important that we ignite that instead of the overly selfish value that can also be in our heads. To talk about problem solving, we have this can-do spirit as people who live in this country. If we put our heads together, we really can move forward together. And finally, opportunity, that this is about expanding opportunity for everybody in the country. That's an important goal. It should be an important goal of our government, an important goal of ours as advocates, and really igniting that value, again, in our audience's heads can just really help start these conversations. Next slide, please. I'm going to, well, go ahead and see if this one works. Next, to open it up, this has some animation in it. So one of the reasons to start with values is because often we start with policies. We start talking about things at a very wonky level, and we know that that turns people off. Most audiences don't know what we're talking about. They're bored or they're confused. We use too much jargon and too many acronyms. So as advocates, most of us have learned that lesson. So we know that we have to talk first at the issue level. So we'll talk about, today I'm going to talk about immigration, for instance, or I'm going to talk about affordable housing. This is clearer, there's no question, but these words all have a lot of baggage attached to them in the discourse right now. Baggage that does not necessarily tell the story that we want to tell. And so, for instance, research has shown that in affordable housing, if you say the term affordable housing, there are some folks on the right who will just immediately think government handout. But then there are people on the left, more left side of the spectrum, who are thinking about failed housing projects of the 70s. So that term alone, you've lost both sides in some ways. Instead of really starting off by saying, we live in a community where we're better off if everybody who works here can also afford to live here. So you started off with this value of community, and you brought people into the conversation. So it doesn't need to take a lot of sentences or a lot of talking, but it's just reminding people what they actually care about. They care about community. They care about equal treatment and opportunity and pragmatism and voice. All of these kinds of things and many others, respect, dignity, I named several of them in the previous slide. These are places to start a conversation. They make people feel better about themselves and their viewpoints, and that's a good place to start instead of people feeling afraid or angry. And you can lead them through more difficult terrain. Next slide, please. And again, this is just a reminder of how much the values of freedom, respect, and dignity really resonated with folks, including persuadable audiences. Next slide, please. Okay, so the third is, so we've got audience, we've got values. Number one is consider your audience. Number two is lead with values. Number three is to support a diversity narrative, and this is just a bigger story about diversity. That the diversity is about strength, it's about solving our problems together, getting to know people in our community, knowing about our differences and understanding them and celebrating them, knowing that division weakens us, that those who are trying to divide us, we saw that message play so well, those who are trying to divide us are making us weaker. We actually are so much better when we're all in it together. And to remind people that we are connected. We're connected together. We are a national community. When we are turned against each other, that weakens us. We need to be stronger together. Next slide, please. And then number 4 is to tell a systemic story, to make sure that we're telling a story at this higher community level and not always just at an individual level. And so the first point here is to talk about systems over individuals. This is not to say that talking about individuals is not important, because it is, but it has to be linked to the bigger community. Because, as I was saying earlier, we as people who live in this country, there are some very strong stories about just individuals. We tend to think on an individual level about both problems and solutions. We attribute problems often to one person's behavior, one person's mindset, and then we attribute the solution to if they just made themselves better. And conversely, if someone's doing a great job, we only attribute the success to their personal ambition and not all of the other things that we know make for a successful person in this country. So including all of the programs and policies that we want. So for example, in the immigration context, often you'll hear a story about an immigrant, someone who comes here, moves here, opens a business, learns English seemingly overnight, and is a success story. Now what we know as advocates who work in the policy realm is that ignores all of the community level supports that somebody really needs to succeed, including immigrants who come here who need integration programs, who need English learning programs, who need maybe small business loans. There's all sorts of things that we need to make sure we're talking about. So we need to, the second bullet point is to connect the dots, to really show how we're all related, to show a cause and effect. When you have these policies, this happens. And also to show a cause and effect to make sure that you aren't just letting people's assumptions tell a story, because our assumptions about things are usually not correct, especially when it comes to race. And so making sure that we're telling a full story about how we got to where we are when it comes to racial equity is going to be really important. And I have a couple examples. And then finally talking about how it's all about all of us. Again, this communal feeling, this community spirit. We're in it together. We're better off when we are all moving forward. We're weaker when we're divided. Next slide, please. So this is an example of connecting the dots. This is a sentence that you might see that actually people have written about drug crimes and black youth. Black youth are arrested for drug crimes at a rate 10 times higher than that of whites. So this tells a story. It relies on assumptions. A lot of folks, a lot of audiences are unfortunately going to rely on their assumption that black youth are arrested more because they commit more crimes. Those of us who know about the inequality in our criminal justice system see this sentence as a fact and go through all of the reasons why in our heads, because we know the stories. We have to connect the dots for other audiences. We have to tell them what's going on. And next slide. Here's an example of how to open that door a little bit. So new research shows that young African Americans are actually less likely to use drugs and less likely to develop substance use disorders compared to whites, Native Americans, Hispanics, and people of mixed race. Yet, black youth are arrested for drug crimes at a rate 10 times higher than that of whites. So it's just a little bit more information. And of course, this is not the full message, because the full message will include leading with values, why it's important that we want safe communities where everyone are treated equally by police. Then we want to talk about this problem, that everyone is not being treated equally, and then talk about a solution. What can we do to make this better? And then tell your audience what they can do. What can they do to make it better as well? This is only part of a message, but it is showing you how to connect the dots when you're talking about the problem in particular. Next slide, please. And finally, to talk about how it's about all of us. This is just an example of talking about how much the American economy would gain if we could close racial gaps in income, that the entire economy would grow. if we weren't seeing the inequalities that we're seeing right now around race. Next slide, please. And then finally, you need to have a solution. And again, one of the reasons that I use this slide is because I think it's Van Jones who says there's a reason that Martin Luther King Jr.'s most famous speech is not "I have a complaint." It is "I have a dream." It's looking forward. It's being forward-looking. We can't just load down our audiences with problems. That's why this research is, I think, so useful, because it really does point a direction of the kind of country we want to be, one that embraces diversity, one that is inclusive, one that stands up to discrimination, and one that is more united than we are now. Next slide, please. And if you could just open that whole slide up. So this is a suggestion for building a message, and I talked about it a little earlier, but it's value, problem, solution, action. The idea of leading with values, which I talked a lot about, introducing the problem, but making sure that that's a threat to your values and your vision of what kind of country we want to be. The solution, to keep people hopeful and restore values, and finally, what your audience can do. Next slide, please. So on the 29th, we're doing another webinar, and we're going to be a lot more interactive in that one. So I apologize that we're getting kind of low on time for questions, but we're going to be way more interactive on the next one. And what we'd like is for all of you to prepare a value, problem, solution, action message based on what you've heard today about the research and the recommendations, and to send it to us. We'll provide all this information in the follow-up email. Send it to us, and we will really workshop through with your challenges, what you're kind of struggling with in the communications realm and the messaging realm, and really talk it through next time on the 29th. So thank you. Next slide. We have time for just a few questions, which we'd love to take. Next slide. So while we wait for questions, again, I just want to remind everyone on the 29th to try out that VPSA. It's a structure that's worked well for a lot of folks that we work with, just in reminding people what makes for a good message that is being strategic about audience and also leading with values, that is important. And we will make all of this available, the slides, as well as instructions for next time. And yeah, we hope that this is useful stuff. And if you don't have questions now, you can certainly reach out to Lucy and myself later, and we're happy to answer questions then as well.
Julie, we do have a question.
Great.
So Tara Mandy asks, the messages were tested nearly a year ago before a lot more divisive events happened. Are they still as strong as a year ago?
That's a great question. I'll let Lucy chime in, but my initial take is that yes, I believe that they still are useful. There's been a lot of division, but there was a lot of division leading up. That election period was not exactly smooth sailing, and we're also seeing at the same time a lot of rhetoric that is resistance, right? So a lot of, there's frustration at the division. There's frustration at the lack of inclusion of that kind of rhetoric. So I think a lot of audiences are more and more open to message that is unifying, message that is championing our values instead of continually degrading them.
Yeah, to reiterate, I actually feel that when we tested the messages, because we saw a change, we began the focus groups at the beginning of February, and then towards the end of February, the beginning of March, you could already see a change in terms of people who were maybe very headstrong in their support for a particular candidate or for a particular policy, beginning to waver on their views. And so I think now that these messages will probably, I would love to retest them, but there would most likely be less resistance, because I think directly following the election, we were seeing a lot of people digging their heels in, wanting to kind of defend whatever decision they had made for whatever candidate, or even choosing not to vote. And so I think now we could even have more of a room, because as Julie mentioned, there's been so much more movement and the growth of the resistance movement. So I feel like these would even resonate even more than they would have a year ago.
All right. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions, but if any participants have any other questions, please don't hesitate to send them to me at the partnership or to either of our presenters, and I will, we can make sure that they get addressed. Thank you so much to Julie and Lucy for doing this wonderful webinar for us. Thank you for everybody's patience on this webinar as we struggle through some serious audio issues. We will be sending around the slides and some sort of recording of today's webinar at the end. And we will also, as Julie said, be sending around more information about our webinar on the 29th that will be a follow-up to this one, and that will include some more of those instructions about that assignment that she was talking about. Thank you, everybody. Stay warm, stay safe today, and we will see you on the 29th. Thank you.